From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Inside the mind of the white-collar criminal, from Madoff to insider traders to Enron and Tyco, why they do it. Today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Eugene Soltes is the Jakursky Family Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School, where he's an expert on corporate malfeasance, of which there's no shortage. He has a Ph.D. and an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his new book is Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of White-Collar Criminals. Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's our honor. So is there some overarching white-collar crook insight that you devolved from all this work?
I came into the project with the perspective with, like many prosecutors, people in the media, regulators often say that a lot of these crimes are committed by people that are carefully considering the costs versus the benefits when they're engaging in them. And really, after working on this project for 7 years, I came away with a different perspective where many of these crimes look like they were committed not because of carefully balancing the costs and benefits, but much more something what I would call failures of managerial intuition. They just didn't see the harm associated with the actions at the time they were making them.
It's one of the things I found most interesting. These guys are all people that became successful because of the way that they could manage the risk-reward ratio, and yet their failure was basically ignoring the risk-reward.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, I think that's the part that is surprising, and so certainly surprising to me, in that we go in certain contexts where we bring in that reasoning, that careful analytical skills. But in many other parts of our life, I mean, if we think of the decisions that we make on any given day, we make hundreds, thousands of decisions which aren't relying on that careful reasoning. And we generally think that the decisions that are going to be most consequential in life are the ones that we're going to stop and be careful about. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think what we see in some of these cases, you can think of a case of Raja Gupta, the former managing director of the company. 23 seconds after a board meeting, he calls a hedge fund trader and divulges some confidential information. And that's not a failure of careful reasoning. That's a failure of his intuition, one that he successfully developed over decades, but seemingly failed at that moment.
And not only was it seemingly out of character, he made no money off of it.
Right, and that's the part that's surprising in a lot of these cases. Yeah. I mean, you know, we can talk about greed and hubris, and those certainly are characteristics that we can say are in some number of these instances. But in others, we can't look at money as being the primary driver. It just doesn't fit. They make none. In some cases, it actually looks like they make really quite trivial, if anything at all.
What was your methodology? Did you talk to each of these folks? How'd you go about developing the info?
So what I started with, I mean, this project very much started as a personal interest, not as a piece of scholarship. It started with the question we all have of, you know, why do these really successful people that we see on the cover of magazines, speaking at commencements, get into these challenges they face? So I originally wrote a number of the people that I, like many people, once respected so highly, people like from Enron, Dennis Kozlowski, the former CEO of Tyco, and asked them some of the questions I think that were on the top of, I think would be on top of any of our minds. And from that, I started to develop relationships. So in some cases, it was meeting with people in person. Other cases, corresponding by letter or email if they're at a federal prison, or meeting with them, sometimes before, during, and even after they serve their sentences.
All righty. One of the things that comes out of this book is often these guys don't have a sense of the wrong or aren't very remorseful. So a good place to start is some that probably interests people the most out of your book was there's a lot of Madoff stuff. What ended up being your net take?
Yeah, I mean, Madoff is exceptional, even compared to the other. There's nearly 50 people that I spent time with that are in the book. He knew his victims. These were friends, family members, people within the Jewish community, which is pretty different than a lot of other white-collar crimes in which the actual victims are distant. They can't readily be identified. And in the instance of Madoff, he doesn't have a great deal of remorse, and and actually thinks of ways in which, you could say it's a justification or rationalization about why, in some sense, why he doesn't feel remorse for the people that actually were deeply harmed by his actions and deception.
Do you come up with a sense that he might be a psychopath, like a lack of empathy, responsibility? And obviously you tell a story about either Andrew's death or was it Mark's suicide?
Yeah, it was. I mean, in both cases, Madoff has mentioned both. I mean, which I do allude to in both cases. But I mean, I think when talking about his sons and talking about his victims, I mean, there is an unusual to a quite extraordinary level, just a lack of being able to empathize. I think with the challenges they faced and the devastation. And this is not just his victims in the fund, but I even think his family, in some sense, his family members too, which I describe. And in this case, and I know people within the psychologists that would actually say he has a number of characteristics associated with psychopathy.
One of his skills, at least what seems to me, is an amazing ability to compartmentalize, because the stress that he was bearing during this, because this is the kind of thing that's got to blow up at some point. Can you talk about that? Did he have an ability to deny reality?
Yeah, it's a clever ability to deny reality. I mean, one of the questions which I spent a lot of time, asking him and discussing was, how did you think this would end? I mean, he's a smart enough. I mean, he's a brilliant guy.
Yes, he is.
How do you think this is going to unravel? I mean, the point where he stopped trading, he couldn't maintain the unrealistic belief that I could eventually get out of this, which is what a lot of these guys have. Mm-hmm. What's going on? There might be some way I could get out of this if, I hit the jackpot. But when you're not even trading, that can't happen. And ultimately what he reflected at one point is that after 9/11, he saw that a lot of the vaults for the major financial institutions were destroyed. And it was very hard for the firms to actually figure out exactly who lost what money and what was going on, because they lost the underlying raw documents. And so he reflected to me that, after that day, he actually thought, well, what happens if there's another 9/11? It could happen. My records could be destroyed, and there'd be no way to put them back together. And while he kind of, in this eerie way, reflected that, people would die, he would lose his family. If it happens, it happens, but that would be a way of resolving his fraud.
He kind of had a sense, too, that, hey, these guys, some of the folks lied on their net worth forms to get in here. Everybody cheats on Wall Street. Everybody in Europe uses tax havens. Did he kind of think that he was just sort of, this is the way Wall Street is?
I think so. And I think it's, unfortunately, I mean, we see this confirmed in, I think, a lot of circumstances, whether, I think the recent, political election and, why, Americans are uniformly unhappy with the the discourse in political settings. We could say the same thing in a business context, in which there's a lot of deception. Some of these are small white lies, but it's those little white lies, the small things that seem inconsequential, that are quite pervasive, that end up growing. You could say a slippery slope into the more consequential ones. In
fact, you're mentioning the recent election. Trump, to me, shows a huge ability to lack empathy. Sort of shows some narcissistic tendencies, lies a lot. Do you attach some of the stuff that you saw to Madoff maybe to Trump?
I do mention in there that people with extraordinary degrees of hubris, the ability to have a lack of self-awareness is worrisome, I think, in leadership, because it's the sense of that infallibility is what leads to people not seeking counsel when they need it and making good decisions. I mean, in the case of the recent election, I hope Trump, President-elect Trump, surrounds himself by people who will help advise him and actually, I think for all our benefit.
You just made a good point as we get down to about just over a minute to go. This lack of self-awareness, that seemed to attach strongly to Madoff. He doesn't even know why he did it.
Yeah, this is a self-awareness, which is, I think, one of the most challenging issues I see with Madoff and a number of the others, is that once you become so well respected within an industry, you're the CEO of a firm, you don't look to other people for counsel. You believe that you can successfully resolve it yourself. And in some sense, that's the problem, is that had he spoken to other people when he started to get into these troubles much earlier, I think he might have been able to come out of it. I don't think he was destined to actually create this fraud. And he was a well-respected person in the industry because he was an intelligent person. And that's I think the humbling and really, I think, tragic part about his story is that millions thousands of people lost billions of dollars, and that didn't have to be the case.
And in fact, he didn't discuss it with anybody, not even his sons or his wife. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell on Business Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Next, we're going to look into some of these white-collar criminal cases. And we're back with Harvard Business School professor, expert on corporate malfeasance, Eugene Soltes. I want to look now in where there's a lot of gray areas, accounting manipulation, which we see in a lot of cases. Enron is a fascinating story, a lot of off-balance sheet stuff. And Andrew Fastow went to Tufts, where I went undergraduate. Give us your sense of Enron.
Enron was a company where, although most people think of it as one kind of giant fraud without any underlying business, I think it's quite the opposite. Enron was a set of brilliant managers that, if anything, they could be faulted for having too many businesses. But it's their ability that when those businesses might have not been performing as well as they wanted to, they were never willing to see something as a failure, and what they wanted to do is really brush it under the rug. And that's what they kept doing with all these financial transactions. Anytime they didn't want to have to deal with it, they brushed it under the rug. And I think, as we all can appreciate, if you put enough stuff on the rug, eventually at some point someone's going to step on, the dust is going to fly out. And that's ultimately what happened.
There's a lot of conflict of interest, too. Fastow was the chief financial officer, and he was also running some of the special entities off balance sheet, negotiating essentially with himself. But you quote him as having a great line, "If I had character, I might not have let all this go on." That's kind of a self-condemning statement.
I mean, when people are placed in these settings, and this is not, I think, to fault Fastow uniquely. I think this can be said for a lot of people, is the situational pressures that managers face, and we have a lot of evidence around this, seems to dominate character in a lot of instances. And we like to believe that if we have just the right character, we can overcome those pressures, incentives, the norms surrounding. Mm-hmm. But that's difficult. And I think, Andy's one of the individuals that fell prey to those, the incentives. I mean, Enron was at one point probably the most well-respected, one of those valuable firms in the world.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you had any contact with Jeff Skilling, and you tend not to attach a lot of moral fallibility to these things, like you just said with Fastow. But I've been told that Skilling, even when he was at Harvard Business School, was kind of a liar, pathological type. Did you have any exposure to him and Enron? And he may have been the driving force behind this aggressiveness.
I think there was a culture. So I did communicate in a number of emails with him, but he's still in prison and settling a number of legal matters. So I chose not to write about it, given some of those ongoing legal issues. I mean, the entire culture at the top of Enron was one of ambition, and we could also say a degree of hubris as they gained some success. Really, some of the challenges they ran into, I see, is primarily ones of strategic. They were off at times, which you could say was led by Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay. But what really was quite astounding when it came to Enron was how their finances were created, their financial transactions. And in that regard, that was led by Andrew Fastow, the CFO, of creating these elaborate thousands of off-balance sheet entities, and ones that, at times, I would say were probably legally, but very aggressively managing the balance sheet. And other times, and ultimately, why were they convicted? Although most of the convictions are actually around really technical violations, not around the broader substance that there was fraud, but rather technical violations to the accounting.
Okay, but the reality on Enron is that it collapsed and ended up at zero, took Arthur Andersen with it. Tyco was another growth, almost binge-driven under CEO Dennis Kozlowski, but it was a real business. It was not. It did not end up going away or anything. Does that? And the other thing is, to me, the issue there is not so much Kozlowski. It's that the board abdicated its responsibility. Almost everything he did was approved or, et cetera. Or were bonuses that were given out, some with or without understanding, as opposed to, blatantly illegal intent.
Yeah, I readily agree. I mean, Tyco and Dennis Kozlowski's are just a fascinating case in that Kozlowski was, and I think deservedly so, respected as a successful manager and grew Tyco from a pretty unknown entity into a global conglomerate and was richly rewarded. I mean, he was one of the highest paid CEOs at the time, $100 million plus compensation. But it's within that environment that he was also, ultimately convicted of embezzlement. And this is where I think it starts to become very kind of gray about what his responsibility and what the board's responsibility was. I mean, I think one of the points that Kozlowski has raised and other people have raised is that, if he was going to engage in embezzlement and fraud, creating hundreds of pages of documents showing how things were forgiven was probably not, it's not a particularly smart way of doing it. And in fact, the board seems like they would have actually given him more resources had he gone through all the checks and balances associated with receiving that compensation for giving loans.
I think it was more using the corporate assets as a piggy bank, because what they were doing essentially was, hey, we're getting these huge bonuses, so we'll take a loan in the interim, and then when the bonuses they'll pay themselves off. As opposed to, that's not stealing money so much as it is using it as a piggy bank. Let's look at Lehman, because I've interviewed the bank examiner there, and here's another sort of gray area. They had this thing, Repo 105, which essentially allowed them to manipulate their balance sheet, and the examiner thought that was of criminal nature, and Dick Fuld, who was a CEO, or anybody there, never seems to have been held accountable for anything.
Yeah, which many people, I think, quite rightfully have pointed out, including Judge Rakoff, one of the more prominent judges looking at white collar, that I think in the examiner report it mentions fraud 1,000+ times, but technically, legally speaking, there was no fraud from a criminal basis. I mean, the transaction. This is what it becomes so, I think, challenging, but also I think fascinating when it comes to these actions, is that there's a lot of things that are unethical, a lot of things that are clearly deceptive, but technically aren't illegal, or at least we can't gather the evidence to actually prosecute people for it with the laws in the books, the laws that are kind of on the books at the time. And I think that's a struggle we have both from a prosecutorial system, but also our laws and regulations, because I think what we see in a case like Lehman 105, and we see the internal emails going back and forth. I mean, this was as clear as it gets in terms of manipulating a balance sheet, but whether that manipulation was actually something that was illegal, ultimately that's a judicial, I think, decision to make whether that's actually the case.
What do you think about this now? This has never been charged with anything or whatever, but when Jack Welch was at GE, they had like almost 20 years consistently of quarterly income growth, and that's basically about as possible to do as Madoff's returns. And obviously what they were doing was playing with the reserves in GE Capital for whatever Jack needed to increase. And yet that wasn't considered illegal then, and it resulted in them getting an inflated PE and all of that. What do you think about that?
If anything, that was rewarded by investors rather than punished. I mean, we can think of a lot of actions in which people manage, and it actually leads to success in some cases and harm in others. One example I really like that's in the book is Computer Associates. So This is the case when you have a couple days after the quarter end, some of the contracts were late, and so they backdated it to the following quarter, to the prior quarter. For this, ultimately 8 people went to prison. But we can think about a practice that's people widely do in many firms, which is when you have a strong quarter, on the last week of the quarter, Tuesday, Wednesday, you hit your quarterly results that you expect. What do most firms do? What do most managers do? You close up the books then.
You put them away.
And you start the next quarter strong. Now, that's managing. I mean, you're not showing investors truly what you earned that quarter, and we accept that as okay. We accept that as just basic practice. But that's the exact same idea of managing earnings that ultimately sent 8 people to prison at Computer Associates, just in the opposite direction.
Coming next, fraud in the mortgage collapse in 2008, and we'll look at insider trading. We're back with Professor Eugene Soltes. His book is Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of the White-Collar Criminal. And here's an area that I'd like to talk about that there seems to be a lack of at least criminal accountability, and that's the mortgage market collapse in '08, resulting, at least on a temporary basis, in 40% of the net worth of a lot of Americans wiped out. And the whole chain, from the brokers that sold it to the banks that passed off the risk to the investment bankers and the rating agencies signing off, this appeared to be fraudulent all throughout the chain. What do you think?
I agree. Deception at every level of that chain. And the people that have generally been held accountable are, by and large, lower-level individuals within organizations. There are no leaders. And to the extent that the lower-level people within an organization that were doing exactly what they were told, what they were incentivized to, I actually think it's actually doubly tragic in that regard.
You're talking about Fabulous Fab at Goldman Sachs. There's another thing that was depressing to me was, the famous Abacus case where Goldman essentially bet against its own customers, didn't tell them. And then I've never seen this until it was in your book, that Goldman essentially said, well, our culture is kind of window dressing, which is something that they've always said, the culture is the whole key to their success.
They actually, in a court filing, actually said that their ethics, principles, integrity, those are nothing more than mere statements of opinion. They basically said they were puffery, stuff we say but don't actually mean. I mean, it's a rather extraordinary admission to actually write from one of the most powerful and in many ways well-respected institutions in the world. I think it's pretty scary. And the judge, quite appropriately in that case, and that's still an ongoing civil case, came back and actually said this is Orwellian. And if Goldman actually means what they just wrote, we're in far greater trouble. So
should any CEO have gone to jail out of this?
I'm always nervous when I say this should, because to the extent that we have a very I'll say a prosecutorial system that both prosecutors and the defense go by a set of principles and rules in which we actually to the extent that people did things that are undoubtedly unethical, undoubtedly deceptive, ultimately I think it is the job of prosecutors to then prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And despite the fact that there's been much criticism of, I think, regulators and prosecutors for not being aggressive enough, my personal view is I think they have the right incentives in many cases to be aggressive. The problem is the resources it actually commands to actually hold people at the top of firms accountable are just extraordinary. And so in many ways, I think what we need to do is give actually more resources to prosecutors to actually take on these really complex and hard cases, so you don't just go with the kind of the low-hanging fruit insider trading cases, for instance.
Okay, we're going to move to insider trading cases now. I've had Charlie Gasparino on. He doesn't think that insider trading harms people. I find insider trading to be cheating and not a good thing. We'll talk about some of these cases, but do you think there's just too much gray area because insider trading's never been 100% defined as illegal, at least?
Yeah, I think that's a problem, especially when we hold people criminally accountable to not put it on our books exactly what defines illicit insider trading. That's problematic. There's a lot of things that are actually legal insider trading, despite the fact of what we all hear that trading is, quote, wrong if you trade on information that other people don't have. That's what we oftentimes hear prosecutors, regulators say. That's just false. There's lots of opportunities to entirely legally trade on information that other people don't have. What you can't do is misappropriate information that doesn't belong to you. You can't steal it and then trade on it for your own personal gain. And that's what makes it illegal.
That's a good entree into Todd Newcomb. And he got inside information that I think by the time it got to him, it had been through 4 other levels. It was clearly inside information. I guess his conviction was overturned. But I ask, I'm pretty confident that he knew he was getting illegal information. But if he's protected in this way, the same way Stevie Cohen is, doesn't that sort of basically give an open season on insider trading?
In his case, I mean, the ultimate source came from an investor relations officer at a firm. And the job of people in investor relations firms is to provide information about the company. Now, if they provide material information that other investors don't have, that's actually it would be a violation of regulation fair disclosure. And that's a violation that the company faces, not individuals face. And so in Newman's case, I actually think it was quite fairly overturned in that the information ultimately came from an investor relations officer through several channels, and it's the company's obligation to not divulge the information in the investor context. But this is where it is very, very gray and very nuanced, and this is why we see he was prosecuted, was sentenced to, I believe, 2 years in prison, and then it was overturned. These things are still changing, which is what's problematic. This should be very clearly laid out ahead of time.
In the case of Princeton, Newport, and Wigton of Kidder Peabody, they used the RICO laws, which they'd used to go after the mob. Do you think prosecutorial abuse is just as big a problem? I think the trustee of the SIPC, Irving Picard, I think has just gone after everything that moves because he gets fees off of anything he can get. Some said Spitzer was too aggressive with AIG and helped bring the company down. What do you think about the other side of the equation?
Prosecutors have just extraordinary amounts of discretion. And I think when they start playing in this round, they take their gloves off too and do whatever it takes to try to get a conviction, which isn't always inspiring. In the case, if we actually go to Andy Fastow at Enron, I mean, ultimately, one of the reasons why it seems as though he actually pled guilty rather than fought the charges against him is that ultimately they indicted his wife along with him for basically tax fraud. They had young children at home, and this was a charge where I don't think his wife played any role in this, but nonetheless, because she was signing also the tax forms that Andy Fastow was signing, ultimately they also charged her in many ways to get him to plead guilty. That's showing how aggressive prosecutors get. I mean, they take their gloves off and are going to go after other family members, do other things to get the person they're after.
What do you think about Mark Cuban? Now, he was on the board of this company. He found out that they were going to do a private placement. He knew that would dilute the equity in any potential IPO. And that seems to me taking proprietary information and trading on it to avoid a loss. But he got off.
By any account, when you ask people what looks like illicit insider trading, it looks like that. You get a call Sunday evening from a CEO that you're friends with or an investment with. They tell you some information that other people don't have, and then the following morning you make a trading decision based upon that, and you save roughly $1 million. That seems to feel like what we think insider trading is. But this, again, goes back to, well, what is the context in which you acquired that information? Did you acquire that legally, or did you misappropriate that information? Right now, at least in the United States, and I should note this differs in other places around the world. If this was the UK, this would not be allowed. But in the United States, if you acquire the information legally, you didn't steal it, you didn't misappropriate it, you can trade on it. And I think one of the challenges that we face is communicating to people that insider trading is not so much about trading on information that other people don't have, but it's actually stealing. And that makes a lot more sense of why you would actually send someone to prison for it.
Talk about business models now. Pyramid schemes like Herbalife, even the Trump network there, where over 90% of the folks fail, and there's EpiPen, which is accused of price gouging, and from your book, The Jeffries Case, where Jesse Litvak was basically concealing prices so they could take greater markups. What do you think about business models that really don't smell well? Versus whether they should be illegal or not?
There's a lot of business models, and frankly, we could say financial institutions for that matter, which the border between doing something that's legitimate and maybe innovative and doing something that actually is blatantly fraudulent is a very fine line. So these multi-level marketing schemes. I mean, The question we want to know is, are people actually buying the product at the end? Is there an end user for it, or is it just simply people joining network and buying the products themselves? Essentially, it's your sellers are buying their own product.
And not making any money once you get down the chain.
And rightly, a lot of multi-level marketers have come under a lot of scrutiny because they're reluctant to disclose how much money the end users actually buy. They hide behind, we don't know that information because that's what our people working for us know, but we as the firm don't know that. And to me, that strikes me as almost absurd answer to provide. You can find this information out. You might require a little bit more digging, a little effort, but that's how you reassure investors and the public more broadly that this is a legitimate business and not simply a scheme, a pyramid scheme.
All right, we're down to about 45 seconds or so. Another way, a business model, looks like regulatory end runs, is an example that you cite like Uber, which says it's a tech platform, not a taxi company, so it gets around all the taxi rules.
A subtle reinterpretation of rules, which sometimes can be innovative. I mean, we think of the Uber and Airbnbs that have reinterpreted regulations, so it seems to work. But in other cases, I mentioned one case, Aereo, this kind of cable over-the-air cable company that argued that they were providing a really long cord between their antenna and our TV. Turned out that the Supreme Court said that's not appropriate.
That's
and they
stealing,
had to
right?
shut down as a result.
Yeah, that was stealing signals, basically, right?
Stealing signals. But again, they had a clever interpretation. It looked like a really long cord. They gave each individual user their own little antenna. They made tens of thousands of antennas. I mean, so the argument that it's a really long cord, I mean, technically speaking, that's correct. But
All
ultimately,
right.
the court said that's not the case.
All right, we'll look at whether some of this stuff is fixable in our final national segment. And we're back with Eugene Soltes from the Harvard Business School. He's been taking us inside white-collar crime. Okay, so obviously the first question is you can't regulate behavior or character defects or a lack of remorse. What kind of overarching changes would you like to see? Or
Yeah, so the first thing that came out from working on this project is that even when people are doing things that are plainly wrong, people don't think they're going to go to prison for it. And I don't think this is because regulators always fail to prosecute people. Because, I mean, even some of these really clear cases where someone's going to go to prison when this gets revealed, people still don't think they're going to go to prison. It's just not something that, when you're in a position of privilege, you could ever see happening to you. And so most of our things that we've tried to do from a regulatory perspective make the prison sentence longer. This crime, it's instead of 6 months, we're going to make it 3 years. That doesn't get us anywhere. You need to consider that you go to prison in the first place.
They should have a realistic chance. People say, for instance, that if one of the CEOs from Wall Street, the Citibank guy or Jamie Dimon, had gone to jail, that would have been enough to deter everybody. Do you think that they should be accountable for living the values of the firms, or that boards should be responsible for making sure that's going on? The culture? Yeah,
I think, well, the recent Wells Fargo case is an example of that, of what happens. I mean, we had 5,000 people were fired for essentially what I see. They're doing their job, what they were incentivized to do. But the culture itself at Wells Fargo was effectively designed because everyone was following it, but was wrong because it was incentivizing people to do the wrong thing. And, it's ultimately only under kind of the political, once this was making top headlines, when they were dragged in front of Senator Elizabeth Warren, that ultimately we see things happening at the board level, ultimately the CEO resigning. And so this is where we saw the CEO being held accountable for those firm values. But this didn't occur illegally. This occurred because of political and media pressure, which is maybe what we need to do to start creating greater accountability. It's not going to be through the traditional rules and prosecutorial system.
Mm-hmm. A good point you make in the book, and this is at the heart of the mortgage crisis too, is the gap now between the CEO and those impacted. There's not a direct link anymore. Is there anything you can do about that?
It's hard because, I mean, we're not going to start teaching at Harvard Business School that you shouldn't design firms where you don't know each person. I mean, the goals of creating a great global firm is to have it grow larger and have many people operating in many different areas. What I think we can do is develop a greater sense, executives and managers, a greater sense of the humility that you aren't going to know all those people, and you're not going to be able to necessarily respond appropriately. Your intuitions aren't going to guide you right in all these instances. So I describe a couple examples in the book of people appreciating those limitations ahead of time and then designing clever frameworks, clever checks and balances on their behavior that can intercede when they might do something wrong.
I want to pursue that. While you were on I went to talk. You're at the Harvard Business School. Are business schools to be any blame? Are they producing amoral students? You mentioned a good point that if a firm violates the law, that maybe on the business school not allow them to recruit for some period of time, like you would do in college sports.
Yeah, it's a question I raise, and a discussion I think would be interesting to have. I mean, there's a lot of externalities, so I think we'd have to think very carefully through that. But to the extent that some firms are doing some things, I mean, we've seen some leading firms in the world laundering money to some of the worst regimes in the world. These aren't representing the values that most of us hold publicly, and certainly they're not the ones that we pride ourselves on within a business school. Should we give those firms that just pled guilty to doing sometimes quite horrendous things, the following week, should they be allowed to come on campus and get the same privileges as another firm that genuinely endeavors to create a both moral and aspirational atmosphere for the employees that work there and the public more broadly? I think most people would say no, it's a privilege to come on a place like a top university campus. It's not a right.
It's a good point. And obviously talent is the key to, especially on Wall Street. Is there a way of fixing ineffectual compliance within companies that could be sort of mandated or somehow driven independently? Point 72 here in Stanford is the surviving family office of Stevie Cohen's what was called criminal enterprise and I've interviewed the new CEO. He's from McKinsey originally, and he has genuinely, completely changed all the compliance and even moving towards culture. It's pretty impressive. Is there a way to make that a regularized thing, or is that just we got to defend on these boards?
Well, I think what you're bringing, there's a genuine endeavor to drastically and oftentimes quite innovatively change the culture, but also how the compliance systems are even reviewed within the firm. I mean, more often than not, compliance is viewed as something as technical rules and regulations. And this is what, Enron had. Enron had plenty of rules and regulations. They had that nice code of conduct book that people have seen. But what those rules did is saying, well, every time you add a new rule, you go talk to your clever attorneys and you sit there and you say, I still want to do the same thing that I did before. That's what a lot of people are looking at when it comes to Dodd-Frank, too. I still want to do the same thing as before, but I know there's 30 more rules in the place. How do I still do that? How do I, ostensibly violate those underlying rules, but not technically? And that's the culture that pervades a lot of firms, and it's that type of culture and that type of belief which leads to a lot of these problems that we see. Do you think that there could be a way, either through the culture accepting it or mandating it, that whistleblowing be a big part of firms, that it you can actually consider doing it without feeling like your career is over? That's, I think, a much harder question. Whistleblowers are people that we, on one hand, all sit here and admire because they're doing the right thing. They're correcting problems. At the same time, none of us like rats. We don't want to work with people who fibbed or told or got their colleagues, friends into troubles at their prior firm or in any instance. It's culture we just don't like that. And I think that's something we all need to sit there and probably think a little bit about, and certainly something I've thought about, is that's kind of that hard contradiction I think we all face. So hopefully what we can do is avoid, and what I would like to see is, rather than having it be the big whistleblowing, if we all took charge within our own environment of when we see that culture starting to deviate from what we think it's supposed to represent. Now, you talk about the importance of these guys having some degree of humility. Mm-hmm. As we finish off in the last minute, what do you take? I mean, you've dealt with all these guys that have been in trouble or bad guys. How do you end up? A lot more humble. I think most of us view these individuals as people that were different than us, and what I came away with, that's the wrong way of looking at it. In most instances, we can't view their decisions as being totally different than the ones that we necessarily would make, because we're not facing their incentives, their culture, their pressure. And if we actually put ourselves in their position and think about their surrounding pressure, circumstances, environment, culture, norms that they were brought up in, I don't know if in a lot of cases we would necessarily make that different of decisions. And I think if we appreciate that in a humble way, this is how we hopefully can start making some changes to prevent those from ever happening in our own lives. Boy, that's a great point. Thanks to Eugene Soltes. That book, again, is Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of the White-Collar Criminal. It's published by Public Affairs. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Next show, we'll have a foreign policy expert on what he recommends the next president should do in the Middle East quagmire. Thanks to Eugene from the Harvard Business School, and thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thank you. And this is segment 5, Overtime, Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Eugene Soltes is nicely agreed to stay on because there's so much stuff in this book. I thought there'd be some more interesting cases that folks would like to hear. But before we get to some more cases, one of the things, and we didn't get much into it, but you did mention it, which is that on the humility side, and we've just got a new president who's not known for it, so this is a good segue to that too, that you think that folks need to become CEOs, leaders, more uncomfortable with dissonance and actually to seek out disagreement. Is that a realistic kind of hope? For, I think, successful leaders, it has to be. It's a really necessary criteria. I mean, it's something where, if we can talk about, presidents, I think where people can disagree with a lot of policies of some of the recent President Obama, for instance, but in many instances, he's been, I think, quite open to disagreement and to see people have different views. Whether President-elect Trump will have the same is unclear. I'll say in the first 2 days, we see that apparently he spoke with Obama and he talked about the health care law. And, the big news story today is that President-elect says he might consider keeping portions of the health care law now. On one hand, I think that's maybe encouraging. On the other hand, we don't know if that's political posturing at this point.
But I thought that was a great tone, too, because essentially it's going to be Obama's legacy, and, you can kill it or just he's already won. So, make it look like you're not killing it. I think a good example, too, that you mentioned that will allow all of us to understand how these things could happen easily without thinking of them is the example you use of speeding, where we're on a highway here at 95, and we know if there's not a cop there, we're going to maybe go 75 or whatever, and we see when we're going to bring it back down. Isn't that the kind of decision-making that can end up putting you in jail in a CEO type of thinking?
It is. How I've thought about this is that we all do things that we know are wrong. We all speed. There's a lot of, I could spend 5 minutes talking about lots of other technical things that we do that we still know are wrong. But speeding is the easy example. We know we're speeding, we know it's wrong, but we still do it anyways. What stops us from proceeding ahead and stops us in our tracks from never even considering doing something is when we know it's harmful. And I think that's the challenge in a lot of leadership positions. It's hard to see the direct harm associated with our decisions in those contexts. And so as a result, you can get this kind of naive or superficial belief that what you're doing, it might be wrong. Then you rationalize it. It's not so bad. And because you don't see the direct harm associated with it, you can actually proceed ahead without a great deal of kind of remorse or concern.
Okay, now there's a lot more cases in the book. I thought we'd talk on some of them. It's a Ponzi related, and this one interests me, is Alan Stanford. To me, his deal, and you can describe it, is incredibly fraudulent. He's got a sentence of 110 years, and yet he talks complete denial, complete innocence with you.
He blames the government. He sees, ultimately he's convicted, and I believe serving 110-year prison sentence for would be the second largest Ponzi scheme after Madoff. But he sees it, and what's interesting about his case, he was running this financial institution in the Caribbean, selling certificates of deposit for above average rates, at least by U.S. standards. Ultimately, the government took it over, put in receivership, and prosecuted him before it ever failed, which is what's so fascinating in this case. Is he was running a financial institution, but it didn't fail. They took it over to protect people. And the question is, there's a lot of financial institutions that run at some point with illiquidity problems or potentially are not solvent. And what he views it as is the government took me over unfairly because I never failed. And everything that he sees is a unfair prosecution by the government as a result, which is a pretty, I'll just say, interesting way of viewing it, because I'll say the evidence from the receivership is quite powerful in suggesting that this business wasn't going to continue successfully.
But wasn't he essentially paying off these higher yield CDs with new money coming in, which is sort of a Ponzi scheme by definition?
That's a Ponzi scheme, but he was also investing. He was also investing the money simultaneously. So, the basic note of a bank. If I play devil's advocate here, let's think of a lot of firms during the financial crisis. Many of them were still paying out to their bondholders, to their people that had savings accounts, people that had CDs to them, and they turned out, because of the losses they sustained from their trading activity, that they couldn't continue. And so, who did they get bailed out by? The government. The government gave them enough funds to make it through the next period. And so they were paying out people with essentially what you could argue is effectively a government loan.
Bailout.
Right, bailout. And in this case, we don't see those firms as being, criminal or fraudulent enterprises. We see that as just in such an anomalous period that they need some additional support.
Yeah,
now, the difference between what might be a temporary, set of mistakes within a firm that temporarily caused the capital to become too low, and what makes a blatantly fraudulent financial institution, there's actually a very subtle line between those two things.
Well, if you had personal communications with Alan Stafford, do you believe him?
No, I'm pretty skeptical. In large part, I will say. I mean, it raises an interesting intellectual point. When would you take over a firm before it fails? But in his case, I mean, if you look at the other individuals operating the firm, I mean, to the extent that he was running, if you look at the returns that they were supposedly generating, they should have been. He should have been one of the finest investors in the world. I mean, we shouldn't be talking about Warren Buffett. We should be talking about Alan Stanford and the staff at his firm.
And wasn't he self-dealing as well, too? I mean, putting some of that money...
There was a lot of self-dealing, a lot of internally, but he couldn't produce how he was actually generating any of these results. And the financial statements didn't provide any information around this. It seems like most of the returns were actually being generated by sets of internal transactions, which is certainly what the receiver has argued.
Interesting. Now, this case of Mark Dreyer, who formed his own law firm, also amazes me. I mean, I think you were talking $900 million of basically fraudulent notes he was able to get hedge funds to actually take, which is to me is also an example of what caused 08, which is his funds seeking yield reach, trying anything they do in a low interest period to get higher yields and let them susceptible to this kind of a fraud.
It is pretty amazing because we're not talking about a lot of the fraud that we're most worried about, where people which don't have the professional background might get duped by someone. But these are talking about top internationally well-known hedge funds being duped by someone that's literally just creating documents and having them sign off for $50, $70 million at a time. Dreyer, he's a Harvard and Yale grad. I mean, no doubt he's intelligent and clever. But simultaneously, it actually is pretty extraordinary in terms of the due diligence that sophisticated institutional investors would do, or I could say the lack of due diligence, that he was allowed to perpetrate this for as long as he did.
I think you mentioned in the book the number of graduates from Harvard Business School that have gotten into trouble or gone to jail. Has the business school done any sort of internal self-critique?
We have. We've done, I think, a great deal of reflection. I mean, and this goes back to all the way in the 1980s when Harvard Business School was among the small number of business schools at the time that were really kind of leading in terms of what we need to do when we think about the ethics and morals of business. What can we do to cultivate this and think about this? Because I think we acknowledge with our own self-reflection that this is a problem within the business community, and our students are going to take on leadership positions and either contribute to making this better or are going to be part of the problem. That said, I think the hard part, at least from the standpoint of a business school, is students will spend, you could say, 40 or 60 hours in a class over a semester talking about some of these difficult moral grade challenges that arise in business. Their first week, if let's say they go to a bank, that's equivalent to their first 4 days at work at the bank. So whatever culture that we've been able to cultivate at that time, 4 days later, they've now been replaced by whatever new firm they're at. So this is where I think as a business school, we can only go so far because people adapt to to their surroundings and the culture around them.
Can business schools do anything at the front end of the pipeline, the admissions office, to see if if there's some character there? Is there any way of doing that?
So it's not what a business school has done, but I'll actually give in this case what Goldman and J.P. Morgan have done for their admissions, which I thought was actually pretty clever, is that they realized they couldn't weed out all the people that might push the lines after they've got in, but they want to make sure at least at the start they have people that are upstanding and will follow rules as they're told. And so what they did was at the end of the first week of their training, these are brand new analysts that got probably their dream of their lifetime, 1 week into their job after college. They gave them a simple test reviewing some of the things they went over that week. And they basically said, there's no real consequences. If you don't pass it, you'll just retake it again next week. This isn't being recorded. This frankly isn't a big deal, but something we just want you to test. But the only rule is you can't go on the internet and Google any of these answers. Just take it based upon your memory of what you learned in the past week. And lo and behold, what happened with a couple dozen of the analysts? What did they immediately start doing? Googling the answers on their work computer. Goldman and J.P. Morgan had that set up to look at that and actually had the software find people that were Googling things on their computer, which was the one thing they were told not to, and then the following week they immediately fired them.
I was going to say, that's interesting.
Which, no doubt, that must have been devastating to those individuals. But to the extent they were making a good point, is that if you can't follow a very, very simple rule that we lay out at the start, even when there's no consequences, you don't have a great deal of pressure. I mean, this is the easiest kind of thing to follow. We probably don't want you here at the firm, because when you actually place a lot of pressure, that's when people really want to push those rules. So I thought that was actually pretty clever. The problem is people know that now, so you can't repeat that same test again.
Let's talk a little bit about where sort of bad behavior is business as usual and what you do. You use a case of GlaxoSmithKline, a pharmaceutical, where it's fairly normal to pay bribes over there, and they actually had some of the nationals working for their firm upset that they weren't getting reimbursed by GSK for the bribes.
Yeah, they were actually outside protesting, and I should note this is in their China, in their division within China. Yeah, it's pretty amazing that they saw that the real kind of moral violation here was the fact that they were not being reimbursed for the company for the bribes they paid, rather than the fact that the bribes were being paid in the first place, which actually just shows you how different cultural norms can be within these different settings.
So do we? I mean, I guess we try now with the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act to apply our morals in foreign countries, but is it completely realistic for the local nationals to do that? And are you putting yourself at a big competitive disadvantage if you don't do it?
Yeah, this is exactly the problem. If one looks back when many of the rules were being passed, in the 70s around Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that was a major concern, that if we don't do this, we're not going to be competitive. And so now I think what we see is a lot of firms going into this very kind of gray world about what's actually bribery and what's normal accepted practices. So I could think of if someone that really enjoys having a fine meal and wine is spending $5,000 on a meal. Is that simply just how you host people, or is that potentially something that's like a bribe? What if you order a couple extra bottles of the 1960 bottle of wine that this person's favorites, and you just let them take it home?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's part of dinner. We didn't drink those bottles. It's a couple $1,000s each. Is that just part of dinner, things that we didn't drink, or is that now a gift that actually could be a bribe? We can kind of just play this game all day long. It's very, very gray. Yeah,
it's interesting. A lot of this stuff is gray. What about Volkswagen and falsifying emission readings? What's the balance between penalty there and making sure it doesn't happen again versus really hurting the company forever?
Yeah, the company, certainly, I think over time facing greater and greater scrutiny because of this. What's remarkable, there's a study by some folks both at Harvard and MIT looking at the consequences of these additional admissions, and found that it looks like approximately 59 people will die because of this greater amount of emissions, because of this deception. And internally within Volkswagen, there's not one person that is thinking about this deception and saying, my God, we've killed 59 people because of this. And that's one of the challenges, that it's right now looked as something that we need to fix in kind of a technical change. We need to adjust our compliance systems. We need to pay off the regulators. We need to recall these vehicles. It's looking in this very kind of agnostic, intellectual way, rather than the ultimately fundamental problem, which is this is a huge environmental catastrophe that has led to actual deaths of people. And I don't know how we ever get people to fully appreciate the deep ramifications associated with those actions, because right now it's being levied as fines, billions of dollars of fines at a place like Volkswagen. But ultimately, the people that are paying the heaviest burden because of that would ultimately be, like in many of these cases, shareholders, investors within the firm. The individuals who actually were doing a lot of this conduct, like Volkswagen, but also like the financial institutions, the sanctions are, by and large, pretty weak by comparison. At worst case, you're fired from your job in most of these instances.
Now, tax avoidance is obviously something that corporations are supposed to do legally, but what do you think about things like, Apple, basically moving to Ireland, moving their patents to, Caribbean countries? Should that be illegal? Is unethical, or they're doing what they should be doing to their shareholders, which is minimizing expenses?
Yeah, as a system-wide, I think we would all benefit from a much more simplified tax code that actually just eliminated these loopholes from the basis. Because from a corporate perspective, this is something that you see firms are both competitively kind of nudged into doing and is well accepted. I mean, even the tech firms, which have the culture like Google of the, quote, do no evil, which try to take this very high-minded principle. It's the tech firms that kind of led this growth into shipping money to Ireland and then having it flow around into different parts of the Europe and the Caribbean that are leading this practice. So the firms that most want to try to, quote, do well are the same ones leading the most aggressive tax avoidance strategies, which, whether they're illegal or not, this is what we're seeing play out in Apple, in which, ultimately, no doubt, Apple had probably hundreds of lawyers review this transaction in every detail that they were doing. Nonetheless, if you start doing things that are this aggressive and that actually lead to billions and billions of dollars in what people think is unfair benefits, this is when you start drawing additional scrutiny, which ultimately can make a practice that was maybe technically legal at the start become illicit, or you face greater sanctions because of that. And so I think this is I think from a firm, even if you can do it legally, technically, if the best securities lawyers that look at it, one needs to think of the broader social ramifications, because that's how you get people like Senator Elizabeth Warren hauling you in front of a permanent, the subcommittee, and damaging your reputation, which is a cost, not a legal cost, from a prosecutor, but a reputational cost, which is not something I think firms always take fully into account.
What do you think of things where it's a lack of impulse control, like an addiction? There was a recent, Ponzi type of scheme where a guy was again going to his friends to keep bringing money in, even going to hedge funds, and then lost all the money because of a severe gambling addiction. Or even Anthony Weiner in the public sector, sexting scandal. He's now in an addiction place. Should that be taken into account?
Yeah, I think this is in terms of the minimization when it comes to the sentencing. I think, in this case, it's a Harvard law school grad. I mean, when it comes to genuine psychological issues that actually might contribute, I think in many cases that makes sense to actually take into sentencing. That said, where I do push back is that many of the individuals, when you see them being sentenced, everyone comes up with reasons why their sentence should be less. And in many cases, when it's these very prominent white-collar offenders, they talk about, the minimization should be because of all the other benefits that they've contributed to society. Now, the trouble is, if you're in a privileged position, you're worth $100 million, you've been the head of a major firm, you kind of almost by definition have probably done some good things simply because you have so much wealth and kind of prestige. If you haven't done a pile of things that you, at least on a sheet of paper, that you can write down as being quite admirable, you're a pretty terrible person. You're in a position of privilege, so those are easy to list. But if you are unprivileged, so we're thinking a lot of people that are poor, people that don't have a lot of resources, and you're being sentenced for something, you don't get to put that laundry list of wonderful accolades and how you've given millions of dollars to charity and helped people's lives. And so I see this is one of the major problems in the prosecutorial and the sentencing, is that people of privilege can cite a lot of additional things about why their sentence ought to be minimized as compared to people of lower privilege. And right now we take that into account. If you can show that you've done a lot of laudable things, you're not going to be punished when you do something bad quite as much.
Not to mention you can have $1 million defense, which...
Right, certainly, which is how you then are able to produce this voluminous about all these things that you've done.
All right, we're going to be full circle on the last question, which is you quote a guy, David Thatcher, who's a CEO of a company called Critical Path in your book, basically saying all CEOs go to gray areas. Do you see, having now talked to over 50 people, when someone hits that path between gray right and gray wrong, what a guy who doesn't go into the wrong area, does he have any different attributes? Is it just humility?
So I think it's humility is at the start, but that's what leads to people doing different things. So this is getting views from outside advisors. And this isn't advisors, lawyers necessarily, but this, I give one example in the book, might be talking to one's spouse, someone that just sees the world a little bit differently, are able to reflect on their practices, are able to actually take more time to think about these decisions, and this really reflects on what they're doing. I mean, as I see and I teach these cases in my executive ed courses at HBS, and we talk about these, where many students start with very high-minded, I would never do any of this, this is totally crazy that these really smart people do this, but this would never happen to me. And this is how the discussion always starts. But as we start kind of turning the screw during the class and starting going to kind of grayer and grayer and grayer decisions, you start to see people, kind of the light bulb going off that, yeah, I can think of in my experience that I've been confronted with this, and sometimes I've done the right thing, and other times I can appreciate that I've probably pushed it quite aggressively, and I rationalized why that's actually not so bad. And you can see students and participants pushing back on one another to, in some sense, create that awareness. And it works really well in the classroom. And people can get much deeper humility and think about how they would solve things more effectively. The challenge is, how do you create that environment that occurs so easily within a classroom setting and transport that into how actual corporate decision-making is made? A lot of these moral decisions are very easy to resolve in a classroom, but seem to be very hard in the actual settings in which they're made. Why is that, and how can we actually reduce that difference?
Great. Thanks to Eugene Soltes for staying with us in the overtime segment. And the book is, as you can tell, is fascinating. And it's kind of unconventional, too, which I think is nice for a business school professor. It's not just a scholarly document. It's exactly as you've heard, why these things happen in a real-world sense and what it's like that even good people can make the wrong path decisions, why they do it inside the mind of the white-collar criminal. Thanks again to Eugene. Thanks to our loyal audience for hanging with us in overtime, and we'll see everybody again next Sunday.